Happy New Year. Our first NYTC Neuroscience lecture of 2024. So we're still mixing it up. We have some virtual, hybrid rather, and some only virtual, but we'll have more hybrid this year. For those of you who are online for the discussion at the end, please put your questions in the chat and we'll read them then. Those of you in here, we have microphones here so we can pass them around. I also hope that you'll join us after the seminar for a reception outside in the auditorium. So with that out of the way, it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lawrence Yang. Dr. Yang is a professor at NYU and is chair at the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. He's also the associate director of the Global Center for Implementation Science and is the founding director of NYU's Global Mental Health and Stigma program. Dr. Yang is a world expert in global mental health and studies stigma and how it affects the course of mental illness in different cultures. Another research interest of his lab, we'll learn more about this today, I hope, is how untreated psychosis impacts cognition in schizophrenia. Today, he'll talk to us about global mental health and psychosis, collaborative opportunities in neuroimaging and genetics. Lawrence, all yours.
Thank you so much for the gracious introduction and invitation. Again, I want to credit my co-parent back there, Neville. And Thomas and I go way back 15 years ago. We had plotted and planned a global mental health project, actually epigenetics project in China. And happy to tell you all about that over a drink during the reception, but it's really great to reconnect with Thomas. So today I'm going to be talking about some of my work in global mental health and psychosis, and I'm really hoping that it will lead to more conversations, collaborative dialogue between, myself, my department, and your center. All right, so I'll just bring this whole slide up. So I also represent the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at NYU. In short, we seek to employ transformative social sciences to realize a groundbreaking and integrated vision of social behavioral sciences and public health. And really, you can think of our Department of SBS as any one of the social sciences as applied to solving public health problems. Our calling cards are interdisciplinary and team science approaches. We've got about 20 faculty members, and these are our particular strengths. I really take my identity from this department strongly. I myself, I'll show you in just a second, I'm a strongly interdisciplinary social scientist. I really seek to integrate across the social sciences to tackle different problems. I'm also a big believer in team science. I'm fortunate enough to be the leader of some of these teams here where we partner quite frequently with folks, biological scientists such as yourselves, to use cutting edge methods. In one of the examples, I'll be describing an example of DNA methylation. So my own work is really breaks up into two broad buckets. The first is that in global mental health, and the second is in stigma of health conditions. My own training is in clinical psychology, psychiatric epidemiology, and medical anthropology. I'll also note that I was at Columbia, I was there for a good period of time, actually, and I know that I have many sort of fellow colleagues in common here. I was faculty at Mailman School of Public Health for 11 years and really, sort of launched my career from there. And I've been at NYU for the past 8. Been a fortunate recipient of some NIH grant funding. I also am PI of a donor gift for about $500,000 from the Li Ka-shing Family Foundation. You can think of them as the Gates family sort of, in Asia, so to speak. I have some genetics grounding in that I worked with Paul Applebaum at Columbia in psychiatry. And so when he had his P50 there, the LC, the Ethics Legal Societal Implications for Genetics Center there, I was a steering committee member. And then lastly, I just want to note that I've been in the global mental health space for a long time. NIMH funded the set of global hubs. There were 3 rounds of it, each one for 5 years. spanning multiple countries, and I was part of 2 of the rounds. So I just, have a lot of contacts all around the world, and it's been, really fun to engage in this work. Today, I'm going to bring you into 3 different contexts, and they're going to be 3 different illustrations of studies that I am now conducting. And again, at the end of each study, I'm going to invite, you all really to think about either neuroimaging or, genetics collaboration. So a lot of these studies do not focus on those at this time, but I think that could easily be added. So the first study is in China, rural China, where I'll be talking about chronic untreated psychosis. And I'll spend most of the time on this first study. The second, and the last 2 studies, I'll go through a little quicker. But the second one is in Botswana. It's comorbid psychosis and HIV. And the third study is in Chile, where there's a set of population registries, which I think present a unique opportunity. So in each one of these examples, I'm really going to be highlighting an interdisciplinary and global approach. What we try to do is try to locate these circumstances within different global settings that enable us to examine scientific issues from a novel or, unique perspective. And so the focus here on each, depending on the context, will be on rare populations, social science and genomics, or multiple national registries. There's again. Okay. All right. So for my first first part, I should say, in China, let me just talk a little bit about cognition, because just to ground us all on the same page. So in schizophrenia, which is really one of my disease of that I focused on for a long time in my career, neurocognitive impairments are quite common. They're common among people who just developed a disease and the people who have the disease for a long time. They span a different domains of cognition. This includes attention, memory, language, motor, and executive dysfunction. And these impairments are medium to large effect sizes. And this is among treated people who first episode psychosis. A note here, in high-income countries, most people get treated, right? If you develop psychosis, as soon as you come into the healthcare system, boom, you're put on antipsychotic medication. So most of our knowledge is really predicated on treated schizophrenia, again, typically within the first 2 years. Cognitive impairments are linked to real-world function. Very busy slide here. So what I'd like you to do, please, is ignore all the text. This is all just supporting literature. Let's just focus on the figure here. So here, y-axis is cognitive ability, low to high. X-axis is age, young to old. So if we look at the dashed line, this is for healthy controls and healthy normals. And unfortunately, as we age, we have a slow but steady decrease in cognitive ability. For people with schizophrenia, they start out lower during the premorbid phase. There is a deceleration during the clinical high-risk period, so when they're starting to develop symptoms. And then at the time of psychosis onset, there is a drop in cognition, typically around 1 standard deviation. At this point, again, because most of these studies are conducted in high-income country settings, people get medicated within the first few years, people are placed on medications. And then conventional wisdom is that cognition actually remains stable as people with schizophrenia age into middle age and older age, okay? And we're going to be looking at that together in just a little bit. So the take home of this real figure is that declining cognition may be evident throughout development, but it's really greatest during this first episode of psychosis, followed by stabilization. So the first question I'm going to be looking at with all of you is to examine effects of illness against treatment. We need to examine cognition in completely untreated psychosis. And it's not conclusive whether there are decreases in cognition with long-term treated psychosis. That line is sort of a consensus, but some findings find a decrease, some findings find stability. If cognitive decreases are occurring, is it due to disease, antipsychotic medications, or both? So this brings me to my first study in rural China. This is a study of cognition of untreated psychosis, and we've had a sequence here of NIH funding. We're in our second R01 at this point. So what enables this study is about 20 years ago, China has actually embarked on the largest program in history to give free medication to all people with psychosis. When I learned about this program, I thought, oh my gosh, well, number one, obviously, wonderful humanitarian treatment program, of course. But I was thinking, oh my gosh, if we can embed a study, right, within such a program, just think about what we could learn. And so I found out about this about 2005. And since then, I was thinking, how can we get a study launched? And so we were able to do so. And what happens is that as people are taken into this pre-medication program, which is known as the 686 program, there's a chance to assess them. What this has enabled was a historic opportunity to illuminate the natural history of untreated psychosis in the community, because China is a vast country and so much of it is rural. People may come into treatment much later than they do in Western contexts. So what we found here, and this completed first R01, we have about 300 completed untreated individuals with psychosis. We have 300 match-treated individuals with psychosis, and then 300 community normals, all from the same community. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about the context, so you'll get a sense of it. The one thing I'm going to say, though, up front, what I keep saying, people within high-income countries typically get treated within the first 2 years. We thought you might find people who are untreated for maybe 5 years, 10 years, something like that, right? But it turns out that our sample of 300 untreated individuals have a duration of untreated psychosis of over 20 years. So I'll just let that sit for a second. So over 20 years of no antipsychotic treatment whatsoever. And that's what enables this really, really rare study. So just a little bit about who they are. The eligibility is 18 years of age, Han or Hui ethnicity. They are within Ningxia province, so that there's a minority group. They speak Mandarin Chinese, so it's not an issue. The exclusion criteria are pretty typical: head injury, substance-induced psychosis, etc. In terms of untreated psychosis, they had to, first of all, meet DSM-4 or 5 criteria, standard diagnostic criteria, current or prior psychotic episode, present more days than not for over a month, and then critically here, have not received any lifetime antipsychotic treatment. And that was an important, so they have never received medication over the course of their illness. We then identified a matched treated cohort. And so these folks, we had to define treatment we did pretty rigorously. So these folks have been receiving regular AP as antipsychotic treatment. And this is over the 30 days prior to assessment. They had to have initiated antipsychotic treatment within the first 2 years of first onset of psychosis. This is important because starting the medication, when the illness starts, could help to arrest the cognitive decline. And then have received regular treatment over the total duration of illness. So at least 50% of the total course of illness, they've been getting antipsychotic treatment. We have very rigorous matching criteria. We match on locale, gender, ethnicity, age group by 5 years, duration of illness by these bands, and then education. And so, all right. And so for the second study, which I'll be talking about in more depth, the overall thesis is to examine the overall effects of antipsychotic medication on cognition. So due to modestly beneficial antipsychotic effects, again, the effects of antipsychotic medications in cognition have really only been looked at in the first, in the first bout of treatment, so to speak. So within the first year or 2 years of treatment. And so our investigation is the first time enables the first investigation of looking at the effects of antipsychotics on cognition across chronic treated schizophrenia versus chronically untreated schizophrenia. Our thesis here is that cognition is going to be worse in untreated individuals with psychosis. So again, we're working not in the Beijing or Shanghai of China. We're working in Ningxia province. This is actually a far-flung western province. It is highly, highly desert, actually. It's very, very remote. It takes about 20 hours to fly from New York City. Oh, interesting. It's okay. Just give 1 second. Thank you. Well, I'll just keep helping for just a little bit. All right, so it takes about 20 hours to fly to Ningxia, and you fly into Yinchuan, which is the capital airport. But you're not done there, because then you take a small propeller plane to the southern part where basically it's less, around the capital city, people get treated because they're somewhat wealthier. And then once you get down here, you're traveling in the mountains in order to find these patients. It's an extraordinary process. I have to point out my all-star team. I think without this study would be impossible. Dr. Michael Phillips is MPI, is probably the top psychiatric epidemiologist in China and Columbia. Actually, he's actually Columbia faculty as well. Min Chen, very capable biostatistician at Columbia. Bill Stone, a neuropsychology expert at Harvard. I have an orange, Dr. Esther Susser. He was actually, he was the chair of Columbia epidemiology. He's a close mentor of mine, and Dr. Machira Keshavan is also the current chair of psychiatry at Harvard. So we have, this all-star cast. It is my great privilege to be able to lead this team in this investigation. This is on one of the trips that I took with Michael's team. Again, we had traveled through the mountains and then hiked through the mud in order to get to find this patient, and we had to knock on all these people's doors. So here we are. This is actually a cave dwelling from traditional Ningxia. I mean, so we were talking, not all the patients, I don't want to give the impression that all the patients live in places like this, but this is possible. These are actually the traditional cave dwellings of folks from this region. This foreboding figure up top is actually the patient's mother, very nice person. So we meet the patient. She comes in from the field. She's the person in the green top. She's been sick for 12 years. She's working, and then she's married actually, and she's wondering, oh, what are you doing here? And so we're just starting to chat with her, and I start to think, oh wow, she's actually, she seems pretty okay. Did we come all this way for her to screen out, which happens all the time to Michael's team? So, but then after chatting a little bit more, she's talking about angels of the universe, they're flying around her, and they're telling her the secrets of the universe. And yes, she believes her neighbors are plotting against her to poison her, et cetera, et cetera. So check, schizophrenia, delusions and hallucinations. The next piece is around verifying the untreated status. In this case, we get them to talk about their treatment history. 12 years ago, she went to the psychiatric hospital with her family. She was prescribed risperidone. The husband goes and actually digs it out, incredibly. And you can see here that one piece is open, but the pill is not taken. So we actually are able to verify untreated status in this case. Again, not always so clear, but it happened in this case. We then assess the patient on a cognitive battery, which we'll get into just a little bit, in sort of the best circumstances possible. This is actually in the patient's in the courtyard. There are animals running around, but she actually does reasonably well for a person in her situation. Afterwards, and vitally important, this is the husband, and then the psychiatrist is standing. Psychiatrist refers the family on to treatment. So there's going to be a medication drop in the next month or so in a neighboring village. And yes, she's already enrolled. You can show up, you can get free medication if you choose. And this is critically important. Very important to the story. Not everybody accepts medication. And we can get into the reasons for that later on, but less than 50% actually of the patients and the families will accept the medication. So let me again point out what's been extraordinary about this study. Again, out of it's 252 people that we have good data on the treated group. On average, they're sick for 23.5 years, and it ranges from 1 to 50 years. And again, there's no other cohort like this where we get a chance to really look at the natural history of the illness. The standard deviation is about 12. The first study showed essentially is we looked at the association between duration of untreatment and cognitive performance. And what it shows is that if you remember the figure I showed you earlier, people start off badly, then they get worse around the psychosis onset and they stabilize. But again, this group, on all the studies that have been done, most of the studies that have been done, it's among people who have all been treated, right? So in our study, because we're able to look at people who have been so chronically untreated, we see actually a continued decrease in cognitive performance. So what this suggests is that cognition could continue to decrease, decline, deteriorate. It's possible. We had a cross-sectional study, so we have to verify this, but it raises this intriguing possibility that it's schizophrenia, we thought, right, cognition might stabilize, that would suggest one process, but here if we see a decrease or decline, it could suggest another process. This first paper was published in JAMA Psychiatry. This cohort, because it's so rare, was named a high program priority by NIMH Council. And I'm a grateful recipient of the Malta Prize. and that's awarded by the Brain Behavior Research Foundation. Incidentally, it's typically given to a neuroscientist or a geneticist, of which I'm neither, but I think it's just a recognition of the really important work that the team is undertaking. Okay, let me go into the second study from this segment. So we also wanted to look at treatment versus untreatment, right? And basically overall effects. Does treatment actually lead to better cognition? And let me just walk you through the findings on this one pretty quickly. So here we're comparing the treated and the untreated cases who are carefully matched on those socio-demographic parameters that I listed out for you earlier. So age, gender, education, locale, ethnicity. And so here you can see on average of 49 years old, 60% female, 4 years of education on average, mostly rural and mostly the dominant Han ethnicity. In terms of this, and also duration of illness is above 20 years, it's about the same. The symptoms, not surprisingly, are actually worse in the untreated group. You can see here, they're all statistically different, higher actually, the untreated group. It makes sense, they're unmedicated group. I have highlighted in yellow some of the key sociodemographic variables that play a part in the story. I just want to note here again, duration of illness is very, very high. And again, under the untreated, over 20 years of chronic untreatment. Also to note, these folks are adults and getting up into mid and older adulthood. And also note is the very low education. So that does play a part in the story. So if we just take a look at the main bivariate results, so comparing the treated and untreated on the cognitive battery. The cognitive battery is based off of some well-established cognitive tests in the field. They reflect 3 large cognitive functioning domains. So it's processing speed, working memory, and social cognition. And there are 6 subtests here. Essentially, you can see here that the treated are higher than the untreated in every single subtest. And these are almost all statistically significant. Only trail making is close. It's a trend. When we look at the multivariable analyses, and I'm going to walk you through one in detail, and I'll just present it very plainly, and then I'll jump to the rest. So what happens? This is one of the domains in processing speed. It's animal naming. In the first model, you can take a look at the group. Okay, so it's treated versus untreated. This is the represents this comparison. In the first model, we're entering all of the sociodemographic variables. We've already matched on these, but this is a control for any residual effects. Age, gender, education, residence, and ethnicity. That's the first model 1. Model 2, we then add in the symptomatology because the symptoms differ between the 2 groups, so positive and negative symptoms. What we can see, and so really just jumping into model 2, what you can see here is that if you're treated, you do better off. The beta is positive, it's significant. Being treated is better off, you're better off in cognition, even after accounting for all these different variables. Education always plays a role in each analysis. So if you have a year of education, each year of education leads to better cognitive performance, makes total sense. Same thing with negative symptoms. Negative symptoms are withdrawal from the world, not being motivated, basic lack of affect, those types of symptomatology from schizophrenia. If you have the higher your negative symptoms are, the worse your cognitive performance. This is also consistent across all the analyses. So if you take a look at all the other different subscales, I won't go through each one of them, but just show you the overall pattern. You can see that the red is always the same, and it's always in the same direction. So basically, treated always do better. Education always plays a role in terms of more education, better performance. Negative symptoms always plays a role. More negative symptoms, worse performance. And that goes for every single domain. So boom, boom, and boom. And then the last 2, same thing. Treatment status, education, and the negative symptoms. So results are remarkably consistent. And what they tell us, again, for the first time using these really rare sample, is that antipsychotic treatment appears to benefit cognition over the long term. And that's actually, I think, a real sigh of relief for the field, for the psychiatry field, because there have been studies that show that prolonged antipsychotic use could also, leads to differential kind of brain volume actually over time. So there are questions about its effects on cognition. What's exciting as well, in addition to this China R01, we're seeking to expand this cohort now. We are trying to really leverage this question of treatment versus untreatment in different contexts where untreated psychosis is more common in the United States. So India and Nigeria, we have a scored R01. We're going back in this year for another for resubmission. So we'll see how that goes. But the aspiration is to expand to India and Nigeria. This could potentially lead to other collaborative opportunities. For instance, Nigeria does allow export of, for instance, blood and genomics to other countries. So that raises a distinct possibility. So let me just wrap up with this section. So in terms of conclusions, long-term untreated group performs worse than the treated group on these different cognitive domains. I did want to note as well, we did do this thing around imputing zero values. So if the patient couldn't do the test, they just got a 0, which seemed like a fair thing to do. That could have, we could have a debate about whether that's a sort of a fair thing to do for the untreated group, but that is what we did, and our cognition experts signed off on it. Education was strongly associated with cognition in our low educated rural sample. There is still the possibility, we've matched on all these variables so carefully, and again, no other studies been able to do this, but it's still possible that the untreated group differs on some variable, right? They became untreated for some other reason that we're not picking up on. So we can't fully rule that out. But the other exciting thing, I want to note this, is that the cognition battery is typically intended for people with 5 years of education and up. We've done an extensive adaptation of it so that it can assess cognition in people with 0 educations to 4 years to grade 4, and because that's really where our sample resides. And so, it enables, as I'll say in the next slide, this cognitive phenotyping. So, okay, this is the potential collaboration slide. So we now have our second R01 in the space. As I mentioned earlier, a large proportion of the untreated patients remain untreated over time. They just refuse treatment for whatever reasons. Actually, my interpretation, it's really inertia. It's because the patient's been sick for so long, they just can't even see a reality, like some alternate reality where the patient takes medications and gets better. It's like, well, we've kind of adapted to this. They're very low functioning typically, and they're just sort of doing their thing. And we're not bothering them. They don't bother us. We don't bother them. So they're not motivated to get the treatment. So what this enables is a longitudinal examination of cognition over time. We're going to follow up the patients 3 years later, see what happens with the cognition. Is cognitive decline indicative of a dementia-type process as these patients age? Possible. In terms of opportunities for collaboration, I would say, just please keep this in mind. If you ever do work in rural, older, low-educated patients, we've developed a tool to enable cognitive phenotyping essentially for groups like this. It would be extraordinary if we could do a neuroimaging study in such a sample, because even a small one, because then we could really look at neurobiological effects of schizophrenia over such a long time period in the absence of treatment. And then in terms of a genetic study, we'd have to figure out a way to leverage the long-term chronic nature of our untreated patient group. I had a great conversation with Gamze earlier. Let's put this question out there. What are the manifestations of symptoms that are being driven by genetics, and we can leverage this treated and untreated status? All right, I'm now going to change context quite dramatically. I'm now going to bring us to Botswana, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And again, these next 2 pieces will go relatively a little quicker. So here, I've got had a string of NIH funding in this area. I have a 3-year R01 at this time, and I have a 1-year supplement to actually add an accelerated aging piece, which I'm really excited to tell you about. So in this concept, basically, I'm doing actually a study of stigma of all things among women with psychosis and HIV in Botswana. And so the women here are comorbid for both conditions. The core thesis here is that because they have these 2 conditions, they may have profound and compounded social and biological consequences. So we know psychosis, heavily stigmatized, HIV, heavily stigmatized. But you could imagine when the 2 come together, it's this concept, what I would call intersectional stigma. The same logic could actually be applied to accelerated aging in each of these conditions. We know that psychosis is tied with accelerated aging, same biological aging, same thing with HIV. but there have been very few studies that actually, to my knowledge, there aren't, I think there's only one, maybe one other study that looks at the intersection between psychosis and HIV. You can imagine that having both of these conditions could lead to what I would call compounded accelerated aging. And so we're actually looking at this through DNA methylation. We're collaborating with Dan Belsky at Columbia. He's been really fantastic. And all, again, full disclosure, pilot studies, mostly proof of concept. It's 180 women with psychosis and HIV. We are leveraging the global circumstance again. And I think, again, you'll see this throughout the whole study, all my presentation. So HIV prevalence in Botswana is the third highest globally. 20%, over 20% of adults have HIV. It's pretty staggering. Women with psychosis are extraordinarily vulnerable. So they're unfortunately taken advantage of by male partners, and all sorts of other unfortunate things can happen. The best estimates actually show that women who come into the inpatient psychiatric setting for psychosis, 53% were actually found to be comorbid with HIV. So there's a huge intersectional risk for women with psychosis to have HIV as well. And this comorbid risk then could contribute to increased risk of physical consequences. So again, NIH-funded grants helping in an examination of this. I'll be remiss, I have to at least bring in a little bit of social science into my talk. So my areas around stigma, and my biggest contribution to the social science field has been around understanding how stigma operates in different contexts. Stigma can affect everything. You can see here from the bottom is the individual sense of self, and then social domain, family, life opportunities, work, education, reading out. But where it really coalesces around this concept of what I call what matters most, which I wrote about in 2007. And what matters most is discoverable through empirical means. And so that's it in a nutshell. I wrote about this in 2007. By social science standards, it's been a highly cited study and really addressed a gap in the field. The aims of this supplement. The first aim is to examine accelerated biological aging in women with HIV with psychosis and linkages to ART. ART is HIV treatment and antipsychotic medication use. So aim 1A, first, basically, and without reading every word here, basically we want to see, is duration of psychosis and HIV associated with accelerated aging, right? And then is the overlap of these two especially associated with older biological age, faster pace of aging? Aim 1B, we want to see if treatment can either, sometimes it could arrest, or sometimes it could actually further exacerbate accelerated aging. So for HIV, the treatment for HIV consistently has shown decelerated aging, but antipsychotic treatment, you can imagine, actually, there's a good argument that it could further compound accelerated aging because it leads to weight gain and all the sorts of comorbidities that are associated with getting older. So we want to test, to what extent treatments act upon accelerated aging. And then, of course, aim 2, we hypothesize that aging-related physical comorbidities will lead to worse stigma and then quality of life. So again, what I think is so nifty about this study is really, I think of it as cutting-edge social science and cutting-edge, right, biological science. So the potential collaborations here, again, a potential neuroimaging study among these comorbid women, because each condition is thought to impact cognition. You can imagine women who are both. This could, again, have neurobiological correlates. This initial study is a proof of concept, but you can imagine if we do find something interesting, a potential expanded genetic study that examines, again, this concept of compounded accelerated biological aging and relation with treatment. All right, so third study. I'm going to bring you yet to another continent, and this is in Chile. This is the Chilean Psychiatric Registry to Advance Risk Prediction, Prevention, and Care. I've listed 2 NIH grants here, but these were really sort of just grants that eventually led to, sort of the foundation of the study. These were actually 2 hub grants that I worked on as a co-I. I was not PI, but I worked on as a co-I, and, has led to, us finally, this sort of spin-off study. So I want to be very clear here. My partners in this have really, Franco Mascaiano is really the PI. He's over at Columbia University. He's a new investigator there. Ezra Susser, I had mentioned him earlier to you, and I've been working with them on this. And again, this is relatively new work that is just being launched. So there's exciting opportunities for collaboration. In a nutshell, there are these huge national registries in Chile. You can think of them as, there are these huge registries in the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, etc. And that enable us to track and monitor patients and their care, etc. The same thing exists in Chile. It is the only country in the global south that has such a resource. And this has enabled Franco actually to identify there are 36,000 people with first episode psychosis or FEP. So, and I'll get into the registries in just one second, but to date, there is no neuroimaging or genetic component. So there could be an extraordinary opportunity, again, to collaborate and to really leverage this rare, comprehensive, and sizable registry. So in this 36,000 person registry, basically what it is, it's everybody who accesses the healthcare system and then gets diagnosed with schizophrenia. Chile actually has what they call it's a National Explicit Guarantees in Health for Schizophrenia program. It's pretty wordy. What it is essentially is it's a universal program that provides care for, it's either free or very low cost care for people who develop schizophrenia. So anybody who develops it is going to come in, hopefully will come into this registry. Again, it's 2005 to present. Linked to this huge registry, and again, I just, it's worth repeating. This is not a representative sample. This is everybody who develops psychosis. We have there are linked birth and death registries. There's a linked hospital admissions and discharge registry and a school-based student survey. And these are the years that they've been operative. And so we have variables that look at perinatal, postnatal exposures, childhood and parental antecedents, educational attainment, physical, mental conditions at school, social, and through the EHR, sociodemographic and clinical characteristics, so comorbidity and mortality. What it looks like is this, actually. This is, and let me walk you through this. So this is the lifetime, prenatal, birth, all the way to death. Here's the registry, really the core registry, the schizophrenia test program, that's what they call it. It's when first episode psychosis is diagnosed. It's the demographics of the patient at the time. Later on, there's hospital admission and discharge, so diagnosis, physical. It includes both psychiatric care and physical health care. And then there are other databases that are linked to it, medications, mental health interventions, so the treatment that they get, both in primary healthcare systems and community health centers. This registry is in the process of being linked, again, to birth certificates, where we can get all this data, death certificates, so we can see if it's linked with, for instance, premature mortality, which is quite common in people with schizophrenia. And then they have pretty good school-based assessments. And so these include things like social, emotional, cognitive development, through teacher observation, through basically a symptom checklist, and then other physical characteristics like height, weight, physical conditions, living conditions, again, social and cognitive development. So what this represents is an incredible opportunity, again. I mean, just even this data is going to take years and decades to really mine fully. And again, at this moment, worth repeating, there's no biological or neuroimaging component. So the opportunities for collaboration include, obviously, potential genetic or neuroimaging study among a representative study of people with non-affective psychosis. This could be large or small. We, of course, by utilizing all these social factors and exposures, could plan an incredible epigenetic study. Once we actually, if we can actually ascertain this representative biological data. And this project, more than the other two that I spoke about, really could leverage that data science and machine learning approaches. I've spoken this again with Gamze, is about phenotypes that are based on EHR records. So we're already, from this day, speaking with core team members, we're already cooking up a collaboration. So hopefully more to come on this in the years to come. So let me just wrap up. This is my concluding slide. I hope today that I give you a little bit of a whirlwind tour, but I wanted to really highlight the interdisciplinary and global perspectives that I brought to examining psychosis in these three different contexts. First, that highlights a rare chronic untreated patient group. Second, which really highlights a social sciences and genomic approach, and the third that has multiple and interlinked national registries. And I really am hoping that this will lead to further collaborative opportunities utilizing genetic and neuroscience methods, and really to leverage these samples, the unique characteristics of these samples in other low and middle income settings, of which I have access to through the global mental health networks. So thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you all today, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Lauren. Amazing, the global reach. Do you have questions for Lauren? Mike.
Fascinating talk. The China cohort. So you have education information, but I'm curious, given the rural setting and the economic condition, does everyone in your cohort have equal access to education? So can we consider that to be a variable that is a factor of the individual, or do you have a group of people whose education is reduced because they couldn't go to school?
No, that's a great. Thank you. Great question. So, well, this has been very tricky. Just to talk a little bit more about this issue, because when you look at education as a confounder or covariate, like we did, that's quite tricky to do in schizophrenia studies, because usually people will say that it's part of the outcome, right? Because if you have bad cognition, then you can't continue in school. But I think, the counter argument that we've made is that, again, over 95% of our sample, about 94%, are from rural settings. And basically they're equally disadvantaged in terms of really, really just poor access to schooling. And because on average, sorry, not getting a little bit away from your question, but on average, because they're only educated at 4 years of school, right? We don't think the illness would play a role in that, right? That's too soon, right? That's too early. You could imagine if it was maybe 8th grade or 9th grade or 10th grade, maybe people are not doing well cognitively and they sort of, okay, well, I'm not going to go to school anymore. But 4th grade is, you're only 8 years old at that point. So, it's probably not driven by the illness. And as a more direct response to your question, in the rural areas, the school system is quite poor and hasn't really improved that much, even though the overall province, GDP has improved. According to my collaborator on the ground, they're pretty equally disadvantaged. But the one caveat are the folks in the urban area, that they would absolutely be able to, access schooling more easily. Thank you.
So,
yes.
Is the frequency of these mental health problems different in these different small villages around this area? Is there any evidence for a genetic basis in this among different communities within that area?
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you. Thanks so much, Tom. So the question is around prevalence and of psychosis and schizophrenia. So Michael Phillips did this great study in the Lancet. I'm blanking on the year, but it was oh boy, I think it was early, 2005 or something like that. 2005. He found that prevalence of schizophrenia was a little bit lower in China than what we might expect worldwide, but not so wildly different than to think it'd be that pretty consistent, overall pretty consistent. And that I don't remember this 100%, so forgive me, but I don't think there were rural versus urban differences. I would have remembered if one number had been wildly out of range, but I think that they're fairly consistent between the two. So
around 1%.
Yes, a little bit less. So 8.8% could be a little bit less than that. But what it does argue too, I think to your point, is that suggests a genetic process, right? If it's distributed evenly throughout the population, no matter it's urban, rural. So
Just to project, they have questions here. But the urban rural, but there has been report and urban effect report
Right, right. So Thomas raises another great point. So, right, that's a great point. So incidence of schizophrenia is higher in urban areas. These are primarily studies that have been done in Europe. But basically, if you grow up in an urban area, then you are more likely to develop schizophrenia. So, you got so that's a really great point, Thomas. I'll have to go back to that study and check out the statistics.
Well, it's not just the strong genetic effect of schizophrenia, but there are other modifiers to depression.
It's a fair assessment.
So with the database in Chile,
Yeah.
you mentioned that, so I don't know if it was established, but if it was established within like, let's say, the last 75 years or sooner.
So, okay, so to be clear, 2005. So the one with people with schizophrenia. So it's been about 20 years, 19 years. Yeah.
So do you have a substantial impact on the death rates you're seeing and on the on what you can actually viably do with the database?
No. Yes, absolutely. No, it's a great point. It's a great point. So a lot of these folks haven't aged to the point where that you can naturally expect them to have passed away. So that's a great point. So some of these registries will be more useful than others. You could, based on the age they entered into the psychosis registry, right? So you can imagine, so if somebody came in 2005 and they were, let's say, 40 years old, maybe the death registry, could be relevant. Less relevant to somebody who just came in under 25, So I totally see and agree with your point. I think that, exactly. So in a sense, honestly, these registries will become more and more valuable, really, as time goes on. Good point. Yes, please.
Something also new from Europe that for the patients who had both HIV and then psychosis, there is accelerated biological aging. So what was your criteria to define biological aging?
Right. So I should have said more about that, a little bit more about this. Obviously, Dan Belsky is the expert in this area, and he's helped me just guided me through some readings. So it's epigenetic clocks, and basically, specifically he uses a second generation clock actually, that he's tested in oh gee, it escapes me. It's in Australia, but he's basically has this rate of aging DNA methylation measure that tracks onto mortality. It's trained on mortality. So, yeah. Yes.
On the topic of HIV, on this, HIV played a role in the development of psychosis, and if that were to be true, how would you sort of determine whether the increase in biological age would be really attributed to the compounded, I guess, effect of both HIV and psychosis, even though psychosis could have been developed on HIV?
May I just applaud that? I think these are our high school guests. Is that correct? We're asking these really great, very thoughtful questions. That's a great question. I honestly, so I'll try to answer this from a data perspective first. We don't have the information on that. So HIV is obviously a stressor. Once you develop HIV, it's obviously stressful, and what's it's stressful. And so you can imagine that could precipitate, any kind of stress could really precipitate psychosis. It's a plausible explanation. Stress plus genetics equals development of psychosis. So but I don't have the data around that. I think it's a perfectly plausible argument. One of the things I will point out, though, I'll take this opportunity, is that in this sample, I think for a second, the women typically do develop HIV for psychosis, which is interesting. So that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on. You can imagine they could be flipped the other way, though. They could develop psychosis, then develop HIV. So we're going to have to. So anyway, we're going to have to disentangle all these interesting things. The ordering of it would matter. Thank you. Not just I always think of it, of course, socially. It's like, well, which is sort of worse to get? If you get in terms of stigma, right? If it's a worse to have psychosis and then have HIV or vice versa. But you could imagine that the sequence of it could matter for biological aging too. So, thank you. Keep that in mind.
Question.
Do you have questions on that?
Yeah, we have a couple of others.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Think about it. My curiosity because if you start treatments after probably define you think or you know
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So we're going to find that out, I hope, in our follow-up study. So it's a great question because let's just say, right, in that little figure I was showing you, the person's already 20 years into an illness, right, and they've been untreated. At what point, could treatment really, sort of have the rebound to a place where, as if, could they sort of regain the status to where they had been, as if they had been treated all along? I don't know the answer to that. I think, but okay, I will say though, we've been doing a set of analyses. This will be the third paper, I think. This may take some time to just fully disentangle. So please don't hold me to this, but it looks like you have to get treated somewhere in the first 20 years. It looks like from our analysis at this point for there to be a treatment effect. If it happens after 20 years, doesn't matter. It won't matter. Whether you're treated or untreated, your cognition goes like this. And part of it, and we're not sure whether or not it's 20 years of illness, and then it just kind of overrides any potentially benefit of antipsychotic treatment. It could also just be aging, right? Because 20 years later, you're going to be in your 50s or your 60s, depending on who you are. So, so it looks like the timing of the treatment is important, but more to come on that.
Thank you for taking my question. I was just going to ask, which antipsychotic was used for the treated group?
Great. Yeah. So unfortunately, Michael didn't track the specific well, did he track the specific medication? We don't have the dose. I've heard that I've asked him many times, and he always says no. The other thing is we might have the medication, but the thing is in China, there's such a heterogeneous group of medications that are prescribed that there's no sort of rhyme or reason. We can't really separate out. So risperidone is commonly used. Clozapine is actually used quite a bit in China, even though it's more regulated here in the US. And then other forms of of antipsychotics just appear. So it's kind of a grab bag. So we're not able to isolate by the different type of antipsychotics.
We may not have sample size, but it would be great if you actually had the psychotic drug, and then you could do an analysis of impact recognition.
Absolutely. Well, we could do that for, I could gently nudge Michael and ask him to do that for, our follow-up study. So absolutely. I mean, that could tie to the rebound, maybe certain medications lead to a better rebound than others. So great.
There's a couple of questions here.
Oh, we have one more.
So I know that data was taken from a lot of different places, and I was wondering that I know like the factor of maybe non-medical treatment, like maybe cultural or spiritual healing, those weren't really taken into account. So do you think that those would be like statistically significant in the cognitive function?
I'm going to take your question and run with it, maybe a little bit different direction. But I love it because you're getting at the social and cultural, aspects, which, near and dear to my heart. Absolutely. The way that the patient and the family interprets the illness, right, is going to, actually, I'd say it's more tied to education, honestly. It's that the low educated patients and family members, they just don't recognize it as psychosis. They just know something's wrong. They know obviously something's wrong with the patient, but they don't know to interpret it as a mental health problem. They might just think of them as either genetic. It's a little bit of an anecdote. So the psychosis registry itself is somewhat of a grab bag. So, and I think this speaks to your issue. So there are people with schizophrenia, but then there are also people with epilepsy in the registry. There are people with mental retardation. They're sort of just all captured, right? And then Michael has to go and figure out and actually give a formal diagnosis. So, so yes, absolutely. The cultural context, the education of the family and the patient really do matter in accessing treatment.
There's one more question, then the question online.
I know that for like measure of something like active
Yeah.
the idea that from the library prescription.
Interesting.
Okay.
Okay.
You mentioned that this was a period.
Right. Negative symptoms. Yes, yes.
There is negative space, or not space around cognitive decline, and kind of put in that sense. This would be
Yes. Thank you. It's a great, again, a great observation. So one of the things that, so if you could just imagine, right? If you are an untreated patient with psychosis, and oftentimes they were living in these really, sometimes we were well taken care of by the family. Even some of them even live independently. Like you saw the one that I showed you the pictures of. Like I would say put her in the top 10% of the people that sort of in the untreated group. Pretty, like cognition was pretty intact. But you could imagine as well. I've seen some of the patients that. I saw this one patient who was in this shack, literally. The family took care of it and sort of put the patient. They would come by and give them food every day. Patient totally mute. Patient also had like 12-inch long fingernails. I'm not joking. Like it just made me shudder. But you can imagine a patient like that who is completely isolated, has no contact, even barely any contact with their family. Of course, their cognition is going to be affected. So one of the things that we are thinking about trying to assess in the follow-up study is the amount of social contact, because that could go a long way in terms of preserving cognition. And honestly, okay, let me segue just a little bit. Right now in the US, there are all these fancy treatments around trying to, it's called cognitive remediation, essentially, right? It tries to mitigate any cognitive loss from psychosis. And I think, those efforts are incredible and, need to be continued. It's harder to do in low middle income country settings, but maybe an easy fix would be, just go talk to the person, make sure they're not so isolated. I think that, that would be a reasonable solution for this kind of context. Thanks.
Okay, let's go to the questions online.
Yeah, it should be hard to emotional.
It's true. Again, this is cross-sectional, small sample, right? This is really a proof of concept study. We are just going to be, this by no means, proves anything one way or the other. We can just see whether or not duration of HIV is it associated with, more accelerated aging, same thing with mental illness, same thing about the concordance. But, there's lots of things that affect accelerated aging. If you have a poor living conditions, if you're, you have, poor housing conditions or homeless, like these things could all affect accelerated aging as well. So,
isn't HIV associated with inflammation, chronic inflammation?
Thank you. Thank you. You're jogging my memory. That's exactly right. That's the mechanism, the inflammation, the specific mechanism that ties HIV to the accelerated aging. So, it's one hypothesis among several, but we're going to look for this initial signal. Fair critique. All right.
With that, thank you, Lauren. Thank you all for coming. You can join